For 10 years, as chief executive of Bennett Holdings, Victoria Bennett had never once brought a man home for dinner. Boardrooms had seen her poise, galas had seen her elegance, but the dining room of the Bennett estate had remained, for a decade, a room reserved only for family. So when the tall black sedan of the household staff pulled aside that evening to let a battered gray pickup truck park in its place, the entire family fell silent. The man who stepped out wore a suit that had clearly been pressed many times over many years, and when he walked through the door beside Victoria, nobody in that grand hallway understood why the most powerful woman in the city had chosen him. Nobody, that is, except an 82-year-old woman sitting quietly by the fireplace, who rose slowly to her feet, took his hand in both of hers, and said the words that would echo through that house for years to come. "You are the man she chose." Marcus Hayes was 39 years old, and on the morning everything began, he was standing 40 feet above the ground on a half-finished parking structure, running his palm along a steel beam like a doctor checking a patient's pulse. He was a structural engineer, and not an ordinary one. Contractors across the city both respected and feared him, because Marcus Hayes had built a reputation over 15 years for one simple, unbreakable habit. He never signed off on a project if there was even the smallest unresolved risk. Developers had tried charm, had tried pressure, had once tried a bribe disguised as a consulting bonus, and every single time Marcus had simply looked at them, set down his clipboard, and said the same quiet sentence: "If the numbers do not work, I do not sign, and it does not matter who is asking." He had once walked away from a six-figure contract with a firm that wanted him to approve a foundation report he knew was incomplete, and the story had traveled through construction circles the way certain stories do, gaining a little weight each time it was told. Some called him difficult. Most called him the only engineer in the city they would trust with their own family's safety. He drove a pickup truck that had crossed 200,000 miles, wore the same 3 suits on rotation for anything resembling a business meeting, and lived alone in a modest 2-bedroom house that had belonged to his late wife's family before she passed away nearly a decade earlier. He had never remarried, had never particularly tried to, and had built his small consulting firm from nothing after leaving a senior position at a much larger company that valued speed over safety. His crew of 6 engineers, most of them younger, all of them fiercely loyal, liked to joke that Marcus trusted concrete more than he trusted people, though anyone who had worked beside him for more than a season understood the joke was only half true. He remembered birthdays. He noticed when a young draftsman looked tired for 3 days running and quietly asked if everything at home was all right. He paid overtime even when a client refused to reimburse it, insisting that his people would never absorb the cost of someone else's poor planning. None of it was performed for an audience, because in 15 years of running his own firm, Marcus had never once given an interview, never once posted a project to promote his name, never once allowed his office manager to submit him for any of the industry awards that arrived unsolicited in the mail each spring. He simply did the work, checked it twice, and went home. Victoria Bennett arrived at the site that morning in a car that cost more than most people's homes, wearing a coat the color of storm clouds, carrying with her the particular restlessness of a woman who had spent the last several years being agreed with by almost everyone around her. Bennett Holdings had acquired the site 6 months earlier, and Victoria, 37 and sharp as a blade, had come personally to walk the property because she trusted her own eyes more than any report handed to her by an assistant. She noticed Marcus before she noticed the building itself, mostly because every other man on that site straightened his posture the moment her car door opened, while Marcus did not even turn his head. He was still tracing the beam with his palm, murmuring something to himself, entirely uninterested in the arrival of the woman who technically owned the ground beneath his boots. It struck her immediately, the way a small detail sometimes strikes harder than a grand gesture. She had spent a decade surrounded by men who rearranged their entire posture the instant they learned her name, men who complimented her handbag before they discussed her question, men whose eyes flickered toward her net worth even while they were supposedly looking at her face. Marcus Hayes did none of that. When her assistant finally introduced them and said the words "Chief Executive Officer," Marcus simply nodded once, said it was good to meet her, and returned his attention to the blueprint spread across a folding table, because in his mind, the beam mattered more than the title. Victoria stood there a moment longer than necessary, watching a man who seemed entirely unaware that he was supposed to be impressed by her. She told herself it was simply unfamiliar, that she was not accustomed to being treated like any other visitor to a job site, and that the feeling settling in her chest was mild curiosity and nothing more. But as she walked back to her car 20 minutes later, she found herself glancing once over her shoulder at the man still bent over his blueprints, and she could not entirely explain why. The disagreement came 4 days later, in a conference room on the 31st floor of the Bennett Holdings Tower, and it was there that Victoria first understood exactly what kind of man she had met. She wanted the project accelerated. Her board wanted it accelerated. The timeline on paper showed that cutting 6 weeks from the schedule would save the company nearly $2 million, and Victoria had built her career on decisions exactly that decisive. She laid out the plan calmly, expecting the usual chorus of agreement that greeted her in every other room she entered. Marcus said no. He did not raise his voice. He did not soften the word with unnecessary apology either. He simply opened a folder, spread 3 pages of load calculations across the table, and began walking her through them one by one, explaining in plain, unhurried language exactly why the compressed timeline would force the concrete curing process to overlap with structural loading in a way that introduced measurable risk 5, 10, even 20 years down the line. Victoria pushed back, citing industry standards, citing other firms that had done exactly this kind of acceleration without incident. Marcus listened to every word, and when she finished, he answered with a sentence that stopped her cold. "A building can be built fast," he said, "but trust takes decades to earn back once it's broken, and it only takes one collapsed parking level to break it forever." Nobody in that room had spoken to Victoria Bennett like that in years. Her own board members softened their disagreements with compliments sandwiched around every objection. Her executives phrased pushback as gentle suggestion, always careful to remind her how brilliant her original idea had been before offering the smallest possible tweak. Marcus offered none of that cushioning. He simply told her she was wrong, showed her exactly why, and waited with the calm patience of a man who had nowhere else he needed to be. Victoria felt something shift inside her chest, something between irritation and a strange, unfamiliar respect, because for the first time in longer than she could remember, a man in front of her seemed entirely unafraid of her power and entirely unwilling to bend the truth to flatter it. She studied the numbers again that night at home, alone, long after her staff had gone. She ran them twice more the following morning with her own analysts, and both times the conclusion was identical to the one Marcus had laid across her conference table without a single ounce of drama. The next afternoon, she called a meeting, informed her board that the timeline would remain as originally planned, and authorized the full redesign that Marcus had recommended, at a cost that made several of her executives visibly wince. When she told Marcus the decision over the phone, there was a brief pause on his end of the line, and then he simply said thank you, in a tone that suggested he had expected nothing less from himself and very little from her, which somehow made the compliment land even harder. In the weeks that followed, Victoria found reasons to visit the site more often than any project of this size truly required. She told herself it was oversight, that a chief executive should stay close to major investments, and there was enough truth in that explanation to keep her from questioning it too closely. But each visit taught her something new about the man she had originally dismissed as simply another contractor to manage. She learned, through quiet observation rather than direct conversation, that Marcus kept a small notebook in his shirt pocket, where he wrote down the names of every worker on every site he managed, along with small personal details: a daughter starting college, a father recovering from surgery, a birthday coming up in the next month, so that he would never forget to ask the right question at the right time. She learned that he paid, out of his own pocket, and without telling anyone, for a young apprentice's continuing education courses after learning the young man could not otherwise afford them. She learned that he refused, every single time, to let anyone address him as Sir, insisting instead on his first name, regardless of who was speaking to him or how much authority they carried. None of it was calculated for effect, because Marcus had no way of knowing Victoria was watching most of these moments unfold from a careful distance, and that, more than anything else, was what convinced her the man in front of her was exactly who he appeared to be. She noticed that Marcus ate lunch every day at the same folding table as the construction crew, sharing sandwiches and stories with men whose names he clearly knew, rather than retreating to any private space reserved for supervisors. She noticed that he made his own coffee from a battered thermos, rather than accepting the espresso her assistant offered on every visit, and that he drove himself to and from the site rather than hiring anyone to do it for him, despite what she now understood, through quiet inquiries to her own staff, was a fairly comfortable personal fortune. He never once mentioned his own accomplishments unprompted, never dropped names or numbers to impress anyone standing nearby, and seemed almost uncomfortable whenever a compliment came his way, deflecting it back toward his crew or his calculations rather than accepting it for himself. The moment that settled something permanently in Victoria's mind came on an afternoon in early autumn when a sudden storm rolled in over the site without warning. Workers scattered for cover, engineers ducked under overhangs, and Victoria's own driver rushed forward with an umbrella meant for her alone. But before she had even registered the rain properly, she saw Marcus moving in the opposite direction of shelter, crossing the muddy lot toward an elderly cleaning woman who worked the site's temporary offices, a woman nobody else seemed to have noticed, struggling with a cart of supplies in the downpour. He held his own jacket over her head, the entire walk to the trailer, soaking through his shirt in the process, and never once glanced toward the parked cars where a dry seat and a warm engine waited for him. Victoria stood beneath her umbrella and watched the entire scene unfold, water darkening the shoulders of his shirt, his attention entirely on a woman whose name was probably unknown to most people who passed her every day. Something settled quietly into place inside her chest in that moment, a recognition simpler and steadier than attraction, though it carried attraction inside it too. This was a man who behaved the same way whether an audience was watching or not, and in Victoria's experience, that kind of consistency was the rarest currency in the entire city. She invited him to dinner the following week, framing it carefully as a professional gesture, a thank you for the redesign that had already begun proving its worth. Marcus declined without hesitation, his voice polite but entirely firm. "If this is about the project," he told her, "we can discuss it at the office like we always have." There was no offense in his refusal, no drama, simply a man drawing a boundary he clearly considered obvious, and Victoria found herself oddly more intrigued by the rejection than she had been by any acceptance in years. A week later, she called again, and this time she did not disguise the invitation as business. "My grandmother would like to meet you," she said instead, and something in her voice made clear this was not a request born of strategy. Evelyn Bennett rarely asked to meet anyone connected to the company anymore, her heart condition having slowly narrowed her world down to the people who mattered most, and when she had asked about the engineer Victoria mentioned so often, without quite realizing it, Victoria had not been able to refuse her. Marcus considered the request for a long moment, and then agreed. Not because of Victoria, he later admitted, but because refusing an elderly woman's invitation felt, to him, like a small failure of character. Word of the dinner spread through Bennett Holdings faster than any merger announcement ever had. In 10 years, Victoria Bennett had never brought a man to the family estate, had never mentioned a personal relationship in any context beyond the occasional gala escort chosen purely for appearances. The idea that she was bringing home a structural engineer who drove a pickup truck and wore the same suit to every meeting sent a ripple of astonishment through every floor of the tower, whispered in elevators and break rooms, with the particular fascination people reserve for anything that breaks an unspoken pattern. The Bennett estate that evening was lit warmly against the coming dark, its long driveway lined with cars that had arrived earlier for what had quietly become something closer to a family gathering than a simple dinner. Victoria's cousins, her uncle, several family friends who considered themselves close enough to earn an invitation, all sat scattered through the sitting room when Marcus walked through the front door, in his pressed but visibly aged suit, his shoes clean but clearly resoled more than once. Conversations paused. Eyes moved, quick and evaluating, taking in the truck still visible through the front windows, the watch on his wrist that was serviceable rather than luxurious, the quiet, unhurried way he carried himself through a room clearly designed to intimidate. Victoria felt the tension the moment they crossed the threshold, and she watched her family's faces carefully, searching for any flicker of warmth and finding mostly careful, guarded curiosity instead. Her uncle Richard, a man who had built his own fortune in commercial real estate and never let anyone forget it, extended a hand to Marcus with a grip just a shade too firm, sizing him up in the particular way certain men do when they feel their territory quietly threatened. Dinner began not long after, the long table set with more silverware than any single meal required, and the questions started almost immediately, some genuinely curious, others carrying an edge sharpened just enough to test. They asked him what firm he worked for, and seemed faintly disappointed when he described a small consulting practice rather than a recognizable corporate name. They asked how he and Victoria had met, and exchanged glances when he answered honestly that it began with an argument over a construction timeline. Richard asked, with a smile that did not fully reach his eyes, whether engineering paid well these days, a question so transparently about money that even Victoria stiffened in her seat. A cousin named Diane, seated near the far end of the table, asked in a tone that pretended innocence whether Marcus had ever considered work with a bit more room to grow, and another relative wondered aloud whether it felt strange to date a woman whose family owned half the buildings he had probably worked inside at some point in his career. Marcus answered every question the same way he answered everything, calmly, honestly, without embellishment, and without a trace of defensiveness, as though the questions carried no sting at all, though Victoria suspected some of them did. He never once raised his voice, never once reached for a story designed to impress the table, never once mentioned anything that might have shifted the family's guarded expressions into something warmer. He simply answered, ate his meal, complimented the cook by name after learning it, and waited out the evening with the patience of a man who had faced far more difficult rooms than this one. When Richard pressed further and asked directly whether Marcus felt out of place inside a house like this one, Marcus set down his fork, considered the question honestly for a moment, and answered that he had helped design structures far larger than this house, and had learned long ago that a room's size never determined whether a man belonged inside it. His character did, he said, and returned to his meal without waiting for a response. Victoria watched him from across the table, watched the careful evaluation happening in every set of eyes around them, and felt her stomach tighten with a worry she rarely allowed herself to feel in front of others. But there was one person at that table who had said almost nothing at all throughout the entire meal, and it was that silence, more than any question asked aloud, that would end up shaping everything that followed. Evelyn Bennett sat at the head of the table in a chair positioned slightly apart from the rest, her hands folded in her lap, her sharp eyes moving quietly from face to face, while everyone else focused their attention on Marcus. She had built the foundation of the Bennett family fortune, alongside her late husband, more than 50 years earlier, had buried a husband, outlived 2 siblings, and survived a heart condition that had already tried to take her twice, and in all those years she had developed an instinct for reading people that no amount of money or education could replicate. She noticed, as no one else at that table seemed to, that Marcus had quietly pulled out her chair before anyone reminded him to, that he had thanked the serving staff by name each time a dish arrived, remembering names offered only once in passing conversation. She noticed that when the young woman refilling water glasses nearly dropped her tray, Marcus was the only person at the table who rose halfway from his seat to steady it, before settling back down as though nothing had happened. She noticed that twice during the meal, when the conversation grew sharp around him, he redirected attention gently towards someone else, rather than defending himself, more concerned with keeping the room comfortable than protecting his own image. Nobody else registered any of it. The rest of the family remained focused on the truck outside, the modest watch, the small firm, the absence of any household name attached to his career, weighing him against a scale built entirely from possessions rather than character. Evelyn said almost nothing throughout dinner, offering only the occasional quiet observation. but her eyes rarely left Marcus. And by the time dessert was cleared away, something in her expression had settled into quiet certainty. When the meal ended, and most of the family drifted toward the sitting room for coffee, Evelyn asked Marcus, in a voice that brooked no polite refusal, whether he played chess. He admitted that he did, though not particularly well, and she waved the modesty away with one thin hand, leading him instead toward a small side room where a chessboard sat permanently set beside the fireplace, untouched by most of the family for years. Victoria watched them go, uncertain whether to follow, and ultimately chose to wait nearby within earshot, curiosity outweighing her instinct for privacy. The conversation that followed lasted nearly an hour, longer than Evelyn had spent in private conversation with anyone outside the family in longer than Victoria could remember. Through the partially open door, Victoria caught fragments of laughter she had not heard from her grandmother in years. The particular unguarded sound of someone who had stopped performing and started simply talking. She heard Evelyn ask about his late wife, heard Marcus answer, without flinching away from the grief still present, but no longer sharp in his voice. She heard her grandmother ask about his work, about the parking structure, about why a man with his skill chose to run a small firm rather than climb toward a larger title, and she heard Marcus explain, simply, that he had once worked somewhere that valued speed over safety, and had walked away rather than sign his name to something he could not stand behind. Evelyn asked him, at one point, what he believed made a man worth trusting, and Marcus considered the question the way he considered everything, slowly, honestly, without reaching for an answer designed to sound impressive. A man is worth trusting, he said, when his behavior does not change, depending on who happens to be standing in the room with him. She nodded at that, moved her bishop 3 squares across the board, and told him that her late husband had said something almost identical to her the week he proposed, more than 50 years earlier, in a kitchen far smaller than the one this house now contained. She confessed, quietly, that she had grown tired over the years of watching her grandchildren surround themselves with people who treated the Bennett name as an entry ticket rather than a family, and that something about the plainness of Marcus's hands, calloused from real work rather than gyms and golf clubs, had told her more than any resume ever could. It was during this quiet hour by the fireplace that a piece of Marcus's history surfaced that no one at that table, not even Victoria, had known before. Evelyn, moving a chess piece across the board, with the unhurried confidence of a woman who had played this game for 6 decades, asked him plainly whether he had ever run a larger business himself, something in his bearing, suggesting a man accustomed to leadership rather than simple employment. Marcus paused for a moment, then smiled, the first fully unguarded smile the family had seen from him all evening, and admitted that yes, in fact, he had. Years earlier, long before the parking structures and load calculations, Marcus had founded a small engineering technology company alongside 2 college friends, building software that helped construction firms model structural risk more accurately and more quickly than the industry standard at the time. The company had grown faster than any of them expected, eventually catching the attention of a much larger firm that offered to acquire it outright. Marcus had sold his shares nearly 12 years ago, at a price that left him financially secure for the rest of his life several times over, and rather than chase a second company or a bigger title, he had chosen instead to step quietly back into the work he loved most, the hands-on calculation and verification of buildings that needed to stand safely for generations. He had never advertised any of this, never listed it on a business card or mentioned it during a negotiation, because, in his own words, offered quietly to Evelyn as the fire crackled between them, money had never been the thing he wanted anyone to notice about him first. Victoria, standing just outside the doorway, felt her breath catch in her throat. She had researched Marcus quietly herself, before ever inviting him to dinner, the way any careful executive might, and had found nothing beyond his consulting firm and modest public record, because he had structured his entire financial life to stay exactly that private. She had assumed, without ever quite admitting it to herself, that his simplicity came from limitation rather than choice, and the correction of that assumption struck her harder than she expected. Back in the main sitting room, The mood had grown tense in Marcus's absence, the family filling the silence with speculation that grew less charitable with each passing minute. Richard, emboldened by a second glass of wine and the absence of the man himself, finally said aloud what several others in the room had clearly been thinking all evening. Victoria could marry any titan of industry in this city, he said, gesturing vaguely toward the window as though wealth itself waited just outside it. And instead she brings home a man who drives a truck older than some of the wine in this cellar. The room fell into an uncomfortable quiet, several relatives glancing toward Victoria to gauge her reaction. And it was in that exact moment that Marcus and Evelyn returned from the side room, her thin hand resting lightly on his arm for support. Marcus, having caught the tail end of Richard's comment, said nothing in his own defense, simply nodding politely toward the group and beginning to gather himself as though preparing to leave, unwilling to make anyone's evening more uncomfortable on his account. It was then that Evelyn Bennett, moving slower than usual, but with unmistakable purpose, rose fully to her feet at the head of the room, silencing the remaining chatter with nothing more than her posture. "You all look at his truck," she said, her voice steady despite its age, thin but carrying easily through the room. "You look at his watch and his suit and the name of his company, and you have decided in one evening that you know the measure of this man." Richard shifted uncomfortably in his seat, and Evelyn did not spare him a glance, her attention entirely fixed on the room as a whole. "I have lived 82 years, she continued, "and buried a husband I loved every single day of our marriage, and in all that time I have learned exactly one truth, worth passing down to any of you. Money reveals nothing about a person's character. It only reveals what a person had, or was given, or was lucky enough to build. Character reveals itself in the small moments nobody is watching for." She turned then to Marcus, who stood quietly near the doorway, uncertain what to do with the sudden weight of attention. "This man pulled out my chair before anyone reminded him to," she said. "He remembered every name in this house by the second time he heard it. He steadied a young woman's tray before she even realized it was slipping, and he walked into a storm today, so I am told, to shelter a stranger nobody else on that job site had thought to notice." She reached out and took his hand in both of hers, the same gesture that would later be remembered as the defining image of that entire evening, and looked directly into his eyes, with the clarity of a woman who had nothing left in life to lose by speaking plainly. "You are the man she chose," Evelyn said, "and I understand exactly why." The room remained silent for a long moment afterward, the kind of silence that follows a truth too large to argue with immediately. Victoria felt her eyes sting, unexpected and unwelcome, in front of her entire family, and she reached for Marcus's other hand, almost without deciding to, grounding herself against the sudden rush of emotion rising in her chest. Richard opened his mouth once, seemed to reconsider whatever he had planned to say, and closed it again, retreating instead into his wine glass with an expression that suggested, for the first time that evening, genuine reflection rather than simple judgment. Later that night, after most of the family had said their careful goodbyes and the house had settled into quiet, Victoria walked Marcus out to his truck beneath a sky finally clearing after the earlier storm. She told him then something she had never planned to share, a piece of her own careful research she had kept private out of something between shame and respect. A year earlier, she admitted, she had investigated a small construction contractor who nearly went bankrupt after a much larger client abandoned a project midway, leaving behind unpaid invoices and a company on the verge of collapse. Someone had anonymously covered the difference, quietly and without any public acknowledgement, allowing that contractor and the dozen families depending on his business to survive through the following year. "It took me months to trace the source of that payment," Victoria said, her voice quieter than usual, stripped of its usual boardroom certainty. "And when I finally did, it led back to you." Marcus said nothing for a long moment, clearly uncomfortable with the exposure of something he had never intended anyone to discover. "What made me choose you," Victoria continued, "wasn't the company you built or the money you never mention. It was the fact that you did something like that with absolutely no expectation that anyone would ever know. Most people are only good when someone is watching. You are good even when no one is." She told him then that she had spent years quietly turning away men who arrived already performing for her, men who complimented her intelligence in one breath and mentioned their own portfolios in the next, men who treated kindness as a strategy rather than a habit. She had begun to wonder, somewhere around her 35th birthday, whether the kind of steadiness she watched in old films and read about in her grandmother's stories simply no longer existed in the world she moved through, and whether she had built her entire life around a company instead of a partner, because a company, at least, never pretended to be something it was not. Marcus listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he reached for her hand across the space between them, his grip firm and unhurried, the same way it had been the very first time they shook hands on that job site months earlier. Marcus finally looked at her directly, something shifting visibly behind his eyes, the careful composure he carried into every room softening into something far more vulnerable. He told her, for the first time since they had met, about the years following his wife's death, the long stretch of isolation he had built around himself as protection, and the quiet decision he had made to measure his worth by his actions rather than his achievements, because achievements, he had learned the hard way, could vanish overnight, while character, once built honestly, tended to remain. Several months passed after that evening, months during which the relationship between Victoria and Marcus grew steadily, quietly, away from the noise that so often surrounded a woman of her position. There were no elaborate public displays, no carefully staged photographs designed for attention, simply two people learning each other slowly, through shared dinners at Marcus's modest kitchen table, as often as at any restaurant Victoria could have chosen instead. Evelyn's health remained fragile throughout that time, but her spirit, according to everyone who visited her, seemed brighter than it had been in years, buoyed by Sunday, visits that Marcus made a habit of keeping, regardless of how busy his own schedule became. When Marcus finally proposed, it happened without spectacle, in the same small side room where he and Evelyn had first played chess together, the same fireplace crackling quietly between them as it had that first evening. The engagement that followed was, by design, entirely simple. There was no lavish announcement, no press release drafted by any communications team, no elaborate party thrown to display the moment for anyone beyond the people who genuinely mattered. Victoria had spent her entire career building things meant to be seen from every angle, and she found, to her own quiet surprise, that she wanted this particular moment to belong only to the people who had earned a place inside it. Evelyn, weaker now but present for every part of the small ceremony that followed weeks later in the estate's garden, insisted on one final gesture before the evening ended. She asked for a small wooden box brought down from her private study, and from it she withdrew a watch that had belonged to her late husband, its leather band worn soft with decades of wear, its face simple and entirely without ornamentation. She placed it in Marcus's hands with the same steady grip she had used to hold his hand that first evening, and told him, in front of the small gathering of family who had finally, fully come around, that the Bennett family had never needed another wealthy man among its ranks. "What this family needs," she said, looking around at relatives who nodded now with far more warmth than they had shown months earlier, "is a man who knows how to protect what is right, even when no one asks him to, even when no one is watching, even when doing so costs him something." She looked at Marcus, then at Victoria, standing beside him, with her hand resting easily in his, and smiled the way only a woman who has lived a full, honest life can smile at the sight of something coming full circle. That is worth more than every dollar this family has ever earned combined. Victoria took Marcus's hand fully in hers then, in front of the small circle of family that had traveled such a long emotional distance since that first tense dinner months earlier, and spoke words she had been holding quietly inside herself for some time. "From the moment I met you," she said, "I began to understand that success was never really about power, and it was never really about money either, no matter how long I had built my entire identity around both of those things. It is about finding the person who makes you want to become a better version of yourself, simply by watching how they choose to move through the world." The Bennett estate, once a house that had never in 10 years welcomed a man home for dinner, became in time a house filled again with the particular warmth it had not known since Evelyn's own husband had been alive to fill its rooms with laughter. Marcus never changed who he was to fit more comfortably into Victoria's world, never traded his pickup truck for anything flashier, never stopped eating lunch with the crews on whatever project occupied his attention, never once reached for the kind of performance that so many people around him had once expected. Victoria, in turn, never loved him for anything he owned or anything he had once built and quietly walked away from, choosing him instead, again and again, for the steady, unshowy decency that had first caught her attention on a construction site months before either of them understood what was beginning between them. The family that had once measured Marcus by the age of his truck and the plainness of his watch came, slowly and honestly, to measure him instead by the things Evelyn had seen clearly from the very first evening, the quiet habits of a man who behaved the same way, whether the room was watching or not. And long after that first tense dinner had faded into a story told fondly at family gatherings, one sentence remained at the center of it, repeated by Evelyn herself, whenever anyone asked how she had known, from a single quiet hour by the fireplace, exactly who Marcus Hayes truly was. "You are the man she chose," she would say again, every time. "And I understood exactly why the moment I watched how you treated the people no one else in that room had thought to notice." Years later, when younger cousins in the family asked how the Bennett estate had come to feel so different, warmer somehow, less like a museum and more like a home, the older relatives would tell the story of that first dinner, of the truck parked crooked in a driveway meant for far grander cars, of Richard's sharp comment and the silence that followed it, of an 82-year-old woman rising slowly to her feet to say a single sentence that changed the direction of an entire family. They would tell of Marcus's steady hands, his calloused palms, the quiet way he had earned every ounce of trust in that house without once asking for it. They would tell of Victoria, once known only for her boardroom precision, learning slowly that the fiercest kind of strength sometimes looked like patience, like listening, like choosing a life built on character rather than a resume built on titles. Marcus never stopped driving that same truck, even long after its odometer passed 300,000 miles, and even after Victoria, laughing, offered more than once to replace it with something newer. He kept his small firm exactly the size he wanted it, turning down offers to expand into something larger because he had learned long ago that the work he loved most happened at the scale where he still knew every name on every crew. Victoria, for her part, began appearing less often on magazine covers and more often at community fundraisers. Marcus quietly supported, learning firsthand the particular satisfaction of building something meant to be felt rather than simply seen. Evelyn lived 4 more years after that first dinner, long enough to watch her granddaughter's wedding, long enough to hold Marcus's hand one final time and tell him, in a voice grown thinner but no less certain, that she had chosen well when she chose to trust her instincts about him from that very first evening. In the end, the value of a man was never decided by the color of his skin, or the truck he drove, or the suit he wore to a dinner meant to test him. It was decided by the quiet, unwitnessed moments when he had nothing to gain and chose anyway to do what was right.